There is a version of you that people love completely. They love how available it is, how easy it is to be around, how it never asks for too much, never makes things uncomfortable, never creates friction in the room. They love how reliably it shows up to play its role, how it absorbs tension without complaint, how it seems to need so little while giving so much. And here is what nobody says out loud about that version of you. It was never really you at all. It was something built, carefully, quietly, over years of learning what kept people close and what pushed them away. Over years of watching what happened when the true reaction slipped out, when the real opinion was offered, when something too honest entered the room. And over years of absorbing the lesson that the safest version of the self is the one that makes other people comfortable. The trouble is that a life spent being safe is not the same as a life actually lived. And somewhere underneath all the availability, all the agreeableness, all the carefully managed presentation, there is a person who has never fully been seen. Who has been loved? Yes. Approved of? Yes. Relied upon? Yes. But known? Actually, genuinely known? That is a different question entirely. This video is about that question, and about the thing nobody warns you about when they talk about becoming more authentic, that in order to be truly free, something has to be lost. Not just a habit or a pattern, the version of you that other people have come to depend on, the one they organize their expectations around, the one they call when they need the reliable, easy, uncomplicated version of someone who will not surprise them. Losing that version is not painless. It involves real grief, real disappointment in other people's eyes, and real time spent in the uncomfortable in-between. But on the other side of that loss is something that cannot be faked or performed, the visceral relief of finally being known rather than just liked. Before going further, a quiet note. If this kind of reflection touches something that has been sitting unnamed for a while, subscribing to this channel keeps this space close. These are the conversations that get skipped in most self-improvement content because they are not comfortable and they do not promise easy answers. The curated self did not appear from nowhere. It was built in response to a very specific environment, one where love, safety, or belonging came attached to conditions, where a certain kind of behavior was rewarded and another kind was met with withdrawal, criticism, disappointment, or silence, where the message, spoken or not, was that the acceptable version of the self was the version that made things easier for the people in the room. This is not always dramatic. It does not require a difficult childhood in any extreme sense. It can happen in families where conflict was simply never allowed, where peace was maintained by everyone suppressing what they actually felt. It can happen in friendships where a particular dynamic got established early and simply calcified over time. It can happen in romantic relationships, in workplaces, in communities, anywhere that the implicit rule became, the smoother version of you is the one that gets to stay. And so the curated self gets built, not as a conscious project, but as an accumulated series of small adjustments. The opinion that was swallowed because the room was not safe for it. The feeling that was managed down because showing it seemed like too much. The dream that was minimized because the people nearby were not capable of holding it without making it smaller. The boundary that was not set because the cost of setting it seemed higher than the cost of not having it. Each of these adjustments felt reasonable in the moment. Each one was, in its way, a survival strategy. But together, over time, they formed an identity. An identity that is real in the sense that it exists and functions, but hollow in the sense that it was never truly chosen. This is what psychology sometimes calls the false self, not a deliberate performance in the theatrical sense, but a deeply conditioned way of being that prioritizes external coherence over internal truth. And it carries a cost that does not always register as what it is. The cost is exhaustion, not the exhaustion that comes from too many tasks or not enough sleep, though those can overlap. This is a specific kind of tiredness that lives below the surface, the tiredness of always calibrating, always reading the room, always adjusting tone, volume, content, the edges of expression, to fit what the current moment seems to require, always being slightly more or slightly less than what is actually present internally. This calibration happens so automatically, in people who have been doing it for years, that it no longer even registers as effort. It simply feels like existing. Until there is a rare moment of genuine authenticity, a conversation where something true was said and it was received, or a space where the calibration could be turned off, and the contrast is suddenly obvious. The body feels different, lighter. Something settles that is usually held in a kind of low-level tension. And that contrast is information. It is pointing at the gap between the curated self and the self that has been living quietly underneath it. The other thing that rarely gets said about the curated self is what it actually does to the people around it. The people who love the curated version of someone are not loving that person more deeply. They are loving more comfortably. There is a difference. Comfortable love does not require the beloved to be real. It requires the beloved to be consistent, to be manageable, to continue being the version that does not disrupt the dynamic that has been established. This is why, when people begin to change, when they start withdrawing the performance and allowing something more honest to surface, the people around them often respond with discomfort, resistance, or even hostility. Not because they are bad people, but because the change disrupts something they had organized themselves around. The reliable, easy, convenient person in their life is suddenly less reliable, less easy, less convenient. And what they experience is not the loss of a relationship. It is the loss of a function. This is one of the hardest things to hold when beginning to move toward authenticity. That some people's love is not for the person, but for what the person provides. And that those two things can look almost identical from the inside, until they are tested. The testing happens when a boundary is set for the first time, when a truth is offered that was previously managed, when the no that has always been swallowed is finally spoken, and the response that comes back, the disappointment, the withdrawal, the subtle or overt pressure to return to the previous version, reveals something that was always true but had been covered by the performance. This is not a reason to conclude that all love is transactional or that no one can be trusted. It is, rather, an invitation to see clearly which relationships have the depth to survive honesty, and which ones were built entirely on the version of the self that was easiest to love. What makes this process so disorienting is that the grief involved is not clean. It is not the grief of losing something bad. It is the grief of losing something that felt like safety. Being liked is a form of safety. Being reliable, being needed, being the person people count on for consistent emotional labor. All of this creates a form of social security that is genuinely valuable, even if it is built on a performance. To begin dismantling it is to voluntarily enter a kind of exposure that the nervous system reads, at least initially, as danger. This is where many people stop. Not because they lack the courage or the desire for something more authentic, but because the nervous system has a very long memory. It remembers all the times that something true was offered and it was not received well. It remembers the cost of being too much, or too different, or too honest. And it interprets the move toward authenticity as a repeat of those old risks, even when the current situation is entirely different. Understanding this does not make the fear go away, but it does change the relationship to it. When the resistance to dropping the performance is recognized as an old protection mechanism rather than a signal that change is wrong, something shifts. The nervous system can be worked with rather than fought. This is also why the process of stepping out of the curated self is not best approached as a single dramatic moment of revelation. The most sustainable path is incremental. One honest conversation instead of the managed version. One opinion offered where it would previously have been swallowed. One boundary held where it would previously have been let go. The identity does not need to be dismantled all at once. It needs to be gradually, consistently, replaced with something that has more of the real self in it. But it is worth being honest about what that process reveals in the social landscape. Some relationships will not survive it. Not because anyone did anything wrong in a dramatic sense, but because the relationship was built entirely around the curated version. When that version is no longer available, there is nothing underneath to fall back on. These endings are genuinely sad, even when they are necessary. The grief of them deserves to be taken seriously, not bypassed with the reassurance that better people are coming. They may be, and they may not be, at least not immediately. The interim, between the old social structure that was built around the convenient self and the one that will eventually be built around the real self, can be genuinely lonely. And sitting with that loneliness, rather than rushing back to the performance to relieve it, is one of the hardest parts of this entire process. At the same time, something else happens in this interim that is worth paying attention to. The relationships that do survive the change, the ones that hold through the drop performance, and the more honest version of the self that emerges deepen in a way that the curated relationships never could. Because for the first time, what is being received is the actual person, not the function, not the role, the person. And the quality of that kind of being known is entirely different from the quality of being liked. Being liked offers warmth, comfort, a sense of belonging. Being known offers something closer to rest. The particular rest of no longer having to hold the shape of something that was never quite accurate, of being able to stop somewhere and not be performing. There is also something that begins to shift internally when the performance is consistently reduced. The relationship with the self changes. Because one of the most underexamined costs of maintaining a curated identity is what it does to the capacity for self-knowledge. When the primary orientation is outward, always reading the room, always adjusting, always managing how the self is perceived, the interior becomes a kind of neglected space. The actual feelings, desires, reactions, values, the raw material of self-knowledge, go largely unexamined because there is always something external to manage. When the outward performance is reduced, even gradually, attention becomes available to come back inside. And what is found there is not always comfortable. Sometimes there is grief. Sometimes there is anger that was managed down for years. Sometimes there is confusion about what is genuinely wanted versus what was wanted because it was approved of. Sometimes there is an encounter with desires or truths that the curated self would never have allowed to surface. This is not a breakdown. It is the beginning of something more honest. And sitting with what is found in that interior space, without immediately trying to fix it or manage it or present it in a way that will be acceptable to an external audience, is what gradually builds the kind of self-knowledge that cannot be acquired any other way. This is what true emotional autonomy actually looks like at its foundation. Not the dramatic freedom of someone who answers to no one and needs nothing, but the quieter, more durable freedom of someone who is no longer at the mercy of external approval for a basic sense of okayness. Who can disappoint someone and not collapse. Who can be misread or criticized and hold a stable enough center to know who they are despite it. Who can move through social friction without needing to immediately smooth it over by returning to the convenient version. This is not indifference to others. If anything, it is the beginning of the capacity for real care. Because real care requires presence, and presence requires being actually there. The curated self is never fully there. It is always, to some degree, managing how it lands, how it is received, whether it is doing enough, whether it is being what is needed. Authentic presence means arriving without the management. And when that is what is offered to someone, what they receive is something genuinely nourishing, rather than something carefully constructed to feel that way. The version of the self that others love, the reliable, easy, uncomplicated version, served a purpose. It kept things intact during times when authenticity was not safe. That deserves acknowledgement, not contempt. That version was not a failure of character. It was a rational response to a specific environment. But environments change. People grow. The conditions that made the curated self necessary are often long gone, even when the curated self is still running on its original programming. And part of what moving toward authenticity requires is the recognition that the old protection is no longer doing the job it was built to do, that the cost of maintaining it now outweighs any safety it provides. What lies on the other side of that recognition is not a perfect, unguarded, infinitely authentic self. It is simply a person who is a little more honest today than they were before, a little less managed, a little more willing to take up space with the real version of their experience. A little less terrified of the gap between who they are and who they have been performing. And over time, those increments accumulate. The performance gradually gives way to something more honest. The relationships that remain grow in depth. The internal life becomes richer because attention is finally available for it. And the exhaustion of calibration begins, slowly, to lift. It will not happen all at once. And there will be moments of doubt, moments of longing for the simplicity of the old dynamic, moments of wondering whether this is worth the difficulty. Those moments are part of the process, not signs that it is going wrong. But somewhere along the way, in some ordinary moment, the experience of no longer needing to perform becomes palpable, not as an achievement, just as a quiet fact. And that quiet fact, the simple reality of being present without management, is what the curated self could never provide. no matter how well loved it was. If this reflection speaks to a grief that has been difficult to name, the exhaustion of being loved for something that was never quite real, this channel holds exactly these conversations. Not the easy ones, the ones that matter. Subscribing keeps this space close, on the days when the gap between the performed self and the real one feels widest. Liking this video helps it reach someone who is sitting in the quiet exhaustion of always being the reliable one, always calibrating, always slightly outside of themselves. They deserve to know they are not alone, and that there is another way. Sharing it with someone who seems to be losing themselves in the role they play for everyone else might be the most honest gift that can be offered right now. And in the comments, one honest question worth sitting with. What is one role you have been playing for other people that no longer fits? And what would it mean, even in one small area of life, to set it down?